first disability voter information session. This is such an important issue, and I'm so glad you guys all showed up to support it. I just wanted to quickly thank you and introduce our speaker, Michael Gilberg. Michael Gilberg is a lawyer and an autistic self-advocate who specializes in special education law and is a founding member of the Young Democrats Disability Rights Caucus.
Not a founding member. I'm not that old. I'll defer to Andrew on that.
I'm sorry, my mistake. He was a leader of it.
Not that old.
And he's going to talk to us about some of the challenges disability voters face. And take it away.
Thank you, Jordan, and thanks for having me. Yeah, as Jordan said, I was involved with Young Dems at the state and national level for many years. Then I got old. So, if you want to hear, you can talk to Seamus. So, as he said, I'm a lawyer and I do special education law, but I've also done some election law and I'm very involved with disability rights and voting because it's an issue. Obviously, disabled people make up somewhere between 20 to 25% of the population based on the best data we have, and that doesn't include people who don't disclose or people who think they're disabled. They're not disabled, but they are. I've had people who say to me, well, it's not really a disability. You know, in fact, the county executive in Westchester has a disability, a visual disability, but does not self-identify, consists it's not a disability. So I think that, you know, it's one of the largest minority populations around, because it's probably closer to 35 to 40% when you factor in all disabilities. Yet people don't think of it in terms of a voting block, the way they do racial blocks or the female vote or LGBT. The disability vote has always had less power for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is there are a lot of challenges to voting. And these fall into multiple categories. We have physical disabilities, people in wheelchairs, people with access issues. Then we have blind people who have different challenges to voting. And then you have cognitive and emotional disabilities, which have further challenges. And if anyone has any questions along the way, please just raise your hand. So to start with, I think the simplest thing is you're all familiar with probably the ADA. Is there anyone who's not familiar with the Americans with Disabilities Act? Okay, the ADA was adopted in 1990, before most of you were probably born. And it says that all places of public accommodation must be reasonably accessible to people with disabilities. Voting is considered a fundamental right, so there's no question a poll site must be accessible. And that means the ability for a person to get in, that means the ability for a person to access the right to vote. If you can get into the building, but you can't access the right to vote, it's the same thing as not being able to get in. And I'll get into accessing the right to vote in a few minutes. But so and I've given you a list of resources here. Three in particular, NICL which is the National Council on Independent Living, has a lot of great guides on voting rights. They have a disability, they're a national disability organization that oversees all the independent living centers around the country. Independent living centers, for those who don't know, are local organizations that provide a variety of services: housing, education, Social Security, whatever people need help on. So the National Council has a voting rights organizer named Sarah Blahovic. I've included her info there and spoke to her. If you want to learn about disability and voting, she is the national go-to person, but they could not afford to bring her up. I've also included AAPD, which is the American Association of People with Disabilities. Executive director now is a good friend of mine, Maria Town, and they are the largest national umbrella organization for people with disabilities, and they've started this thing called the Rev Up campaign, which has a lot of, again, resources for voting for people with disabilities. The Rev Up campaign is their effort in a nonpartisan fashion to get people with disabilities active in the process. There's also this New York DVN, which is a voter network. I know less about it. I used to know somebody involved in it. It's through the Center for Disability Rights in Rochester, which is an independent living center, but she's no longer there, so I don't know as much about that. As I said, if for people who experience problems, I have listed Disability Rights New York. Every state has what's called a protection and advocacy organization, which is a legal organization designed to protect the rights of people with disabilities. They're usually disability rights and then the name of the state. So this is Disability Rights New York, and one of their responsibilities is if people are challenged from voting on the basis of disability on election day or beforehand and they need legal help, they're a service that free of charge to people that will help ensure their rights are enforced. And they have offices in Brooklyn, Albany, and Rochester. The Democratic Lawyers Council, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. Wish Liza was here, but there again, I'm sure you know. The DNC has a disability council. I included the Facebook group. Former Congressman Tony Coelho is the chair of it. He's one of the original sponsors of the ADA. If you have any questions, I'm involved. You can talk to Seamus as well about the DNC Disability Council. But the DNC is trying on a very hard to make disability more focused. And finally, one thing I thought worth noting is I've heard a lot of complaints from people that disability has not been addressed in the presidential debates recently, in any debates. And so they are having AAPD is hosting a presidential forum on disability issues in January 13th in Austin, Texas. Now, I'm actually going to probably go because I have a good friend in Austin, Texas, but this is a good place to go where they're going to raise disability issues with the candidates, most likely just the Democratic candidates. This is a partisan room, so I can say that. Trump doesn't care. So, getting to some of the challenges. So let's talk first about challenges at the poll site. So one of the challenges that's common is mobility, people in wheelchairs. Poll sites are not wheelchair accessible. You know, and the poll sites are chosen by local municipalities, towns or cities outside of the city. And in the city, I believe they're chosen by the Board of Elections.
That's correct.
I'm not as New York City proficient, I'm from Westchester.
That's right.
And so they can't make the excuse, well, the elevator's broken, or, well, that sidewalk is just cracked today, and say that it can't be accessible, or we'll carry the wheelchair up the stairs, which has been done before. In fact, a friend of mine up in Orange County today posted on Facebook that there was a big pothole outside the poll site where he's doing early voting as an inspector that he couldn't get in the building easily. I forgot what he said. I'm actually going to check because I think it's relevant to this conversation. But he said that he couldn't get in, so he had to call the Attorney General's office to get him into the poll, help him. He got into the poll site through a back way that he shouldn't have had to, and he had to call the Attorney General's office. That's one other thing about accessibility. It's not okay to say you go in a different entrance than everybody else. You go in the back. Everybody has the right of equal access through a main entrance. If there's steps, there has to be a ramp. If the polling place is not on the ground floor, there has to be an elevator. It has to be physically accessible. A big pothole in front of the ramp doesn't work. And yes, things happen. They can fill it in, but they can't but if they pick a polling place ahead of time that is not fully accessible, that is a problem. So, you know, very often they pick schools and they don't think about the fact that schools necessarily have a second floor and might not have an elevator, or the elevator might not be working. So, you know, there's physical accessibility. Another thing is visual accessibility. Now, obviously, most people get their paper ballot, they fill it out, they put it in the machine. But if you're blind, or you're legally blind and can't read it, you have a problem. You can bring someone to assist you, they can assist you, or you can use what's called the Plan B machine. It's a ballot marking device. It's a specially designed machine for blind people. I don't know the specifics about it because I've never used it, but it's a special design for people with a variety of disabilities. And every poll site is required to have a Plan B machine for blind people, and they're also set up for people who are have physical disabilities that involve not being able to use their arms and might have to use it through breathing tubes. There's a way to do it with puffing breath that I'm not totally sure, but these things must be, they can't say, well, the Plan B machine is broken, or the Plan B machine didn't show up. That must be there. If they open a poll site and they don't have a Plan B machine, they're out of compliance legally. Any questions so far?
I'd just like to offer a comment on that because I'm not sure how I go.
Of course
But
you
I'm
would.
going to encourage everybody here, particularly this year, with all the ballot proposals in the tiny 7.5 font, to use your ballot marking device. You're going to see it in the corner of the room. It's a big gray hole, but it's all touch screen, and as I say, it zooms up the font so you can easily read these ballot proposals. And every time you use that machine, you're helping people. Because the more people who use them, the greater likelihood there is that they will put in a second one. And I use them I'm surprised you don't use it, Michael.
I'm living in a small town in Westchester where,
Everybody should, because you help the community, but here's the thing, I go at 6 AM every voting day, first to vote, go to the BMV and it's done. Now I'm out there electioneering, so I can hang until the repair guy gets there in 45 minutes or an hour. But we need second machines, that's not gonna happen unless y'all help us by using the BMV every time you vote, but particularly this time, it's gonna be a pleasure for you. You know, you don't wanna use that magnifying glass and go through all this. It's fast, easy. Please use your BMV and encourage everybody you know to have fun using a touch screen BMV, so that we get more of them in the poll sites. Okay? Thank you.
thank you. So yes, that's the ballot marking device. And that's the other thing. It's not limited to people with disabilities. Anybody could use a ballot marking device. It's not something that's restricted. It's designed so any person can use it. In theory, they could replace all the machines with them.
They should.
That probably costs more. I don't know the cost. Now, another thing people don't think of often are cognitive disabilities involving problem solving, attention, ability to read. Now, if you have somebody who's got a disability that affects their ability to read, they're entitled to have the ballot read to them. If you have a long proposal, they're entitled to, under the law, to have the proposal read to them and, if necessary, explained. Now, how many people think inspectors are really that up on these proposals and would know how to explain them? Exactly. So that's another thing, is that the voters is making sure people with disabilities are educated ahead of time, particularly on proposals, so they know how to vote. Because quite frankly, these proposals can be very long and complicated. I'm a lawyer and I don't understand some of the state ones I get sometimes about land exchanges and whatnot. So, you know, these are things that people have to be given the everything in plain language and have the ballot explained. If there are candidates on multiple lines, since we have fusion voting, they need to have it explained. If you're voting for Supreme Court, you're voting for 2 for 4. It's not this column is one race. I've seen people who do that. They think everybody in the same column is running against each other and the next column is a different race, when it's really just vote for 2. So these are things that have to be explained and made in as simple as possible. Another thing, deaf people, if they need some sort of assistive technology, it's not usually an issue at polling sites, but it could be, if, you know, that they have to have them. You know, I've seen people with autism, not myself, who've gotten stressed at polling sites, and that's an issue, that they have to provide inspectors training on how to deal with people with disabilities, because you sometimes have overzealous inspectors who like to bully people or don't know what they're doing. The story is, so I live in Westchester, which is a little different than the city, in a small town north of the city. My town was the biggest win for Trump in Westchester, so we have that going for us. And I went there one day to vote a number of years ago, and I'm sure you're all familiar that they're not allowed to ask you for ID unless you meet certain requirements, unless you were registered to vote before a certain date or something. I don't know. I'm old enough that I don't need to show ID. Now, I could, but the guy asked for ID, and I made a point, and he started telling me that if I didn't show ID, I couldn't vote. I said, well, actually, I'm a lawyer with the Democratic Party. You're wrong. And he started pushing, and people behind me were getting annoyed, but I didn't let it get to me. I didn't lose my cool. I called the town clerk, who is a Republican, but I have a very strong relationship with. She sent the deputy clerk with a police officer over, and the inspector was told he was not allowed because he had been asking people for ID all day. And that's a way that a lot, particularly people with disabilities, are intimidated, ask for ID. If somebody doesn't drive and they don't have a driver's license, they might not have ID. So the deputy town clerk said to him, you're not allowed to do this. And his response was, who are you to tell me what I can and can't do? Her response was, this is a police officer. And the police officer told him, you can either be arrested or you can listen to her. So there is that issue with inspectors who are overzealous, and like certain communities, like the elderly, people with disabilities are more susceptible to pressure or intimidation from inspectors who might not want them to vote because either they're taking too long or they're not doing what the inspector wants. And again, they have a right to protection from that. No inspector can say, because of your disability, you're taking too long to vote, you have to leave. That would be a civil rights violation. Imagine if an inspector said, you can't vote because you're a woman, or because you're Hispanic, or because you're LGBT. Now, those things don't affect the length of time to vote the way a disability could, but they're not allowed to discriminate and say, as long as you're in the poll site before 9 p.m., you can be there for 10 hours. They can't throw you out, as long as you're not electioneering. So I think that's something worth remembering. And another issue that's come up that people don't know much about in the disability world and voting is mental illness and mental health disabilities. There are varying state laws, and I'm not as up on New York as I should be, that allow people to be declared incompetent to vote. Only a judge can declare you incompetent, but people have used this to tell certain people with disabilities, you can't vote because you're incompetent to vote. Parents have told their adult children, you're not competent to make a decision. The truth is, every person in New York over the age of 18, barring felony convictions, has the right to vote. Only a judge can take away your right to vote for incompetence. Not your mother, not your father, not your rabbi, not your priest, nobody else, not an inspector. And at the poll site, challenging somebody on the basis of saying that they don't seem competent is illegal. It's an illegal challenge. You can't walk up to have a poll watcher there and say, I don't think that guy knows what he's doing. I challenge his right to vote. That's not a legal grounds. And if somebody challenges somebody's right to vote, that is grounds to call an attorney or call the police and have that poll watcher removed. You can challenge the person because you don't think they are who they say they are. You think they voted in 2 locations, which could be more possible now with early voting, but you can't say, I don't think he's competent to vote. That's illegal. And again, the only person who has a right to take away the right is a judge. So a lot of people with cognitive impairments or intellectual impairments think that they need their parents' permission to vote. They don't. And they also think that they need to let their parents go into the voting booth with them. They don't. So that's been a big issue that's gone around the country, actually, in many ways. It's a much bigger issue nationally than the wheelchair issue because everybody's more familiar with the wheelchair access and physical barriers, and because people can't see these disabilities. They're not visible the way a person in a wheelchair is. You can see somebody's in a wheelchair. You can't see if there's a cognitive or emotional disability. And so this becomes an issue with people challenging competence. And, again, somebody who might be intellectually not as high functioning might think, oh, well, I need ID and I don't have ID, so they can challenge me for not having ID. No, they can't. And even if and at worst, they can get a provisional ballot. A lot of people think if they're not as sophisticated about the process, they think, well, I can't vote, so I can't vote. They don't think, and the inspectors don't necessarily offer them a provisional ballot. I'm assuming you're all familiar with provisional ballots.
Why don't you explain it?
Provisional ballots are if they can't find your name in the book or you're challenged for some reason, you fill out an affidavit with your ballot, and in theory, if you're eligible, the Board of Elections will count it. I've worked at the Board of Elections in Westchester the only years ago when I was in another life, many, many years ago. The only reason it shouldn't be counted is if you were never registered, you voted in the wrong election district, depending, or you voted in 2 locations. That doesn't happen that often, but there are a lot of cases we've had in Westchester where you vote in the wrong election district, so only certain races count. You're not allowed to vote in race, but people will tell disabled people, oh, you could be committing voter fraud, the famous Republican trope about voter fraud. They will use that to scare people, to intimidate people. Again, getting back to the competence issue, there's a mistaken belief by some that if you're under guardianship, if you're an adult who is a parent has guardianship, you all know what guardianship is. Okay, for those who don't, guardianship is when an adult gives legal rights to their parent or another person to make decisions about their life. It can be a limited guardianship or it can be everything. It can be a lot of people who are not able to have guardianship for financial reasons. The parents manage their money or other things. Even if someone's under guardianship, it does not prohibit them to vote. And that's a mistaken belief out there by some people that somebody under guardianship doesn't have the right to vote and that their parents can tell them, no, I don't think you're competent to vote. What happens if their parent is an old conservative Republican and they're a liberal Democrat? Their parent can't say, well, you can't vote. So, that's a mistake out there. So if you ever hear anybody saying, well, my mother and father don't let me vote and they're over 18, unless a judge has ruled it, it's not legal. And this has actually been an ongoing issue it's been going on in the disability community and in some of the autism community, that there are people who've had their voting rights taken away by judges who don't understand the process and don't understand these disabilities, and now they're trying to get them back, and it's not as simple. And a lot of legal organizations like Disability Rights New York, I mentioned, Disability Rights Advocates is a big one. These organizations are filing lawsuits to get people their voting rights back. Fortunately, despite Trump stacking the federal courts, this is a state-by-state issue and really will be decided by state courts, state and local courts. It's not a federal issue because voting is an individual issue. Voting eligibility is determined differently in every state, and the competency laws are different. So it's going to go to a state judge, but there's also the ability to use federal law to challenge the vote, the taking away someone's right to vote. And if you challenge it under federal law, you can go to federal court. So there is that whole, worry about some of the judges Trump's appointing, not to, again, but only the judge can take it away, but also only a judge can restore it. It's really up to a judge. And so it would be, honestly, I think probably a state Supreme Court judge, or if it's under a federal case, it would be a federal district court judge. The other thing that a person with a disability can do if they want, if they're being restricted from their right to vote on election day, is they can show up at their county board of elections and see the duty judge. And every county, I know how they do it in Westchester, they have 3 judges stationed throughout the county that are called duty judges, and what their job is to sit there with all people who are told they can't vote. If the person goes, the judge can issue an order letting them vote on the machine. They don't have to vote with an affidavit and risk it won't be counted. This would apply to a person with a disability too. They go see the duty judge at the Board of Elections or a satellite site, and the judge says, I'm letting this person vote. That's it, they're voting. There's no appeal, there's no ifs, ands, or buts, they're voting. But this is probably, I think, the real cutting edge of disabled voting issues is this mental competence issue. I think we've largely gotten past the physical access barriers, other than the fact that they still crop up, like my friend had today, but people are by and large aware of the issues. This mental competence thing is a much less talked about issue, and it's an issue that's been on the cutting edge in the disability community about who determines competence to vote, who determines if I'm competent or he's competent or you're competent to vote. Nobody gets to determine that. I worked when I was younger before law school at the Board of Elections in Westchester, and we would go to nursing homes and help people fill out their ballots. And there were people who would randomly say, this one, this one, this one, and they were pointing at candidates. They didn't know who they were voting for. They would go from a liberal Democrat to a right-to-life candidate. They were just pointing at random. Now, it wasn't my job to say, well, clearly she's not competent to vote, and these were obviously elderly people who were senile, but it wasn't my place to say, or the Republican counterpart, because you always went as one-on-one, to say whether they were competent to vote or not. But nobody would challenge an elderly person in a nursing home. A younger person with a disability is a much greater target. People are much more willing to challenge somebody in their 20s or 30s or 40s who they perceive as slow or different than an older person because of societal biases. You look like you were at this question too.
Oh, I was just interested in what you're saying, but there are some people questions.
Any questions on that?
I was gonna let it pass, but, so a duty judge, would that be enough to overturn a previous, judgment for incompetence?
Not a previous judge, no, that would be a standing order. But if on election day, if an inspector decides, I don't wanna let you vote, I don't think you're competent, and you're not getting anywhere, a duty judge could do that. If there's a court order, a duty judge who's making a decision day of can't overturn that, because then it's a court order. The only way to remove the previous judicial order is another judicial order. Can you speak up a little? Sorry.
Yes, you mentioned emotional disabilities. You said cognitive and emotional.
Yeah.
Could you say a little bit more about what you were thinking about when you say emotional?
Well, some people with autism can get emotional and can get worked up in certain stressful situations. So you could have a situation where somebody doesn't have the connections I had, like when that guy asked for ID, somebody could get mad and start cursing at the inspector. They can't deny you the right to vote. He just didn't count on the fact that I could call the town clerk's office and have them show up with a police officer and threaten to have him arrested. And I also resisted the pressure from other people on the line saying, oh, just show him your ID, why are you making a scene? And I said, and I wasn't making a scene, and the reason was I was saying, if he did it to me and then people admitted he'd been doing it all day, he was doing it to others, and it's a voter suppression tactic. So, you know, if a person gets mad and says to the inspector, you're an asshole, or I don't like you, or whatever, you're not allowed to deny their right to vote. You know, if a conservative Republican walks in and says to a black person the N-word, as horrible as that is, he can't be told he can't vote because of it. That's what and that's not an emotional disability. I'm just using the example that if somebody has an outburst with an inspector or with someone else in the polling site, they can't be ejected without being given their right to vote.
Were you asking what the difference is?
I was curious about examples, I was
So-
autism an example, I guess, I don't know if there are other.
Emotional people with mental health, bipolar, schizophrenia. Now, obviously, you can't walk into a poll site and start throwing things over, ripping up ballots. There's a limit to being destructive, but if you're not being destructive or you're not hurting anybody, you can say what you want, they can't take away your right to vote. That's the bottom line. This guy tried to tell me, well, if you don't give me your ID, you can't vote. And again, I could have gotten worked up, but I'm like, I'll just call the town clerk and you're gonna, and he's been banned from being an inspector anywhere in Westchester ever again. I heard he came from Yonkers. I live in northern Westchester. We don't want inspectors from Yonkers. I'm waiting to see Giovanni. He's shaking his head. Any other questions?
I wanted your perspective on a situation I had with a blind friend.
Okay.
He asked me to support him with voting,
Right.
and because and I wanted to know, like, who is responsible for ensuring that the people at the poll sites are provided with disability awareness, because I'll tell you what happened. So we went, the person showed him the device, the voting machine.
Wait, are we
and
streaming
then
or not? I just keep
the person stayed with him and just and was watching him vote after they had explained how to use it, and he was fine. He didn't need their help anymore. She stayed, like, standing over his shoulder and watching him vote, and I had to explain to him that she was still there.
The
and
inspector was
he
over his
asked her
shoulder.
to go away.
The inspector was over his shoulder.
The whoever was working at that site and showed him the machine.
Did he ask for you to help him vote?
He asked her to show him how to use the machine.
Okay.
And then he said, "I'm good, thank you."
She
And then
should not have stood
didn't
over
walk
his shoulder.
She stayed there, yeah.
Especially if he needed help, I'm assuming he would have asked for your help.
Yeah.
And that gets to two issues. Number one, the inspector should have walked away. And number two, a person with a disability, like a blind person who needs help, is allowed to ask anybody they want. An inspector can't say that you can't help your friend. You're allowed to bring anybody you want to the poll site to help you vote, except, I believe, your union leader. That is actually the one prohibition, because they don't want unions putting pressure on their workers on how to vote. I believe the only thing you're not allowed to do is bring the head of your union, but anyone else. You can bring your doctor, you can bring your religious leader, you can bring your plumber, you can bring your dog. I don't know about dog, actually, but you can bring anybody to help you vote.
You also can't bring your employer.
I think that's a gray area, depending on your employment situation. Kenny, you had a question?
It's not really a question. I went to go early vote a few days ago, and they were using different voting machines that they're going to be. Usually, I do it by paper ballot, but people have been talking about how difficult the ballot marking devices were. So I tried it out, and the election inspectors told me that they were using a different.
Yeah, I've heard I haven't
ballot
voted
marking
yet, but I've
device
heard
for
they're
early
using a
voting.
different machine for early voting.
Yeah.
If there are problems for you, call Reggie and complain to him. And call Buckwald and complain to him.
So they said they would have it fixed for election day on November 5th. And they were just like, oh, your vote's gonna be counted, but we can't guarantee it with 100% certainty because they couldn't print out the ballot.
Well, they have to guarantee. I would call the Board of Elections, call Reggie's office and see what tell him that. They need to make sure of that. Any other questions?
So,
if you mentioned being asked for ID at the polling place, and if we are asked for ID and would like to challenge it like you said you did, is there a specific thing that we should say in doing so?
You just say that, well, it depends on, again, I don't remember the law specifically because I'm too old to have to show ID. I think if you're registered after a certain date, you do have to show ID. But what you say is, I'm not required to show ID. If they continue to challenge you on it, you can call the Board of Elections, let the Board of Elections come down and tell them, they still, like I did, they still don't want to listen, go to a duty judge and say to the duty judge, I want to vote, and they're asking for ID.
So how would we find the duty judge?
There should be a public listing of it at every Board of Elections. If you call the local county Board of Elections, they'll have a list of duty judges for the day.
Okay.
It's one of those things that people don't know is available at the Board of Elections. Any other questions in the back?
I actually intern at the Campaign Finance Board.
Can you speak up a little?
Sorry, I'm an intern at the Campaign Finance Board, and we do a lot of like outreach with the NYC Votes office. And I just had a question for you about how to best, over the summer, we were doing like a lot of on-the-ground voter registration, and I was trying to help someone who had a cognitive disability register to vote, but he didn't have his caregiver with him, and he didn't have an ID, so I couldn't just fill out the form with him. And I was wondering if you had any recommendations for how to assist people who don't have like a caregiver with them but need extra assistance.
Well, he couldn't give you the information?
No.
I mean, that's the challenge. Without the caregiver and the ID, you're kind of stuck. I mean, unless you know his name, his date of birth, his address, which it sounds like you didn't.
Right. I was just wondering if you had like recommendations for like if there's something that we can give folks who have cognitive disabilities who need further assistance that they can then like give to the person that they need help from.
I mean, it's really hard if you don't have ID or the caregiver and they're not able to fill out the basic information. I mean, somebody has to either help them or they have to have some form of ID to put on the form. But that's another thing, is that there's not a lot of outreach to getting people with disabilities registered to vote, particularly those who live in group homes or segregated living. They don't do outreach and think of those people as potential voters. We as a party do a lot of voter outreach, and disabled people who vote would be largely Democratic. What's interesting is they found most disabled people are Democrats, but the disability vote is about 50-50 because so many don't vote, and there are people who, unfortunately, in the disability community vote Republican because that's what their parents tell them to do. And there are certain disabilities. In particular, there is one disability that votes heavily Republican. Does anyone know what it is? You can't answer, Andrew, because I've told you this before. Down syndrome. And that's because people with Down syndrome are extremely anti-abortion, and they see abortion as a way to eliminate their culture. And so the Down syndrome community tends to vote heavily Republican solely on the issue of abortion, even though services they would want, they're not getting from Trump. But it is the one disability that they have found skews extremely Republican. So I find that an interesting fact that many people don't know.
So to address your question, there are several organizations that will assist people with disabilities in registering to vote. And some of them do so periodically. I know the Center for Independence for Disabled New York has several walking sessions in both Manhattan and Queens that people can go to who might need extra assistance with that.
And in that case, I would, ask him for his contact information and ask him, would you like me to follow up with you once I get information, or have someone follow up with you and then put him in touch with that?
And there was a national, like I said, AAPD is having this Rev Up campaign to help people. I know they're doing something in Westchester. I keep seeing pictures of Kenny on Facebook doing it.
I just participated in a panel, we're trying to encourage people with disabilities to get out to vote, why it's important, and so we did a whole panel, that's what, Michael was talking about, we did a whole panel on that through Westchester, Disabled on the Move, about why it's important to vote and what your rights are, things like that.
But AAPD this is what he went to a panel on. It's part of a national campaign, and AAPD is, I believe, trying to set these up nationally. So there are these efforts, both AAPD and Nickel are doing it in a more nonpartisan fashion, the effort to get people to vote Now, I will tell you, all the people doing this are extremely liberal Democrats, but it's technically nonpartisan to get people to vote and get the disability vote. One thing Sarah Blahovic at Nickel is doing that's a big deal is she started the first ever disability candidate training. Because what is the best way to change laws affecting people with disabilities? Having disabled people in office. You know, people, you know, and it can't just, and people don't realize that there are more disabled people in office than they realize. Everybody looks at Congress and thinks it's just Tammy Duckworth and Jim Langevin from Rhode Island is a congressman. No, they're the only two in wheelchairs, but there are people with other disabilities. There are Congress members, I'm sure, who have autism, who have dyslexia, who have other learning disabilities, who have cognitive impairments. I won't go into all the people who've tried to armchair diagnose Trump, that's a different story. But there are people with hidden disabilities in Congress. And that's something people don't think about often. And at lower levels of government, is the way you change laws is you get the people with the disabilities in office. You know, I think that's a big thing. And so what Sarah Blahovic at Nichols doing is the first disability candidate training to train candidates, and her long-term goal is to create a disability candidate training forum in a way to model something like Emily's List is for female candidates, or I think it's called the Victory Fund for LGBT candidates, and I believe this is similar for Hispanic and African American candidates. There's not that model for disabled candidates, and obviously disability crosses the other has intersections with all the other groups, but it adds certain layers of challenge that the other things in an ideal world don't have. You know, as I would say, in a perfect world, there's no male or female way to vote. There's no black or white, gay or straight way to vote. But a disabled person will always need accommodations. A person in a wheelchair will always need a way to get into the polling site. A blind person will always need help seeing the ballot. In the perfect world, those other things have nothing to do with how you vote, but disability can always be a factor. And honestly, people with certain cognitive disabilities that are lower IQ are more susceptible to pressure and games. That's just a fact. That's not you know, you don't have that issue where IQ is not related to race, gender, or sexual orientation, but IQ can be correlated to certain disabilities. People with Down syndrome are generally lower in IQ than the average population. They are more susceptible to people. That is why there's this issue I mentioned with abortion. People with other intellectual impairments are more susceptible. It's not always nice to say, but it's a fact. And so you have to realize that in the ideal perfect world, which we are far from, that the disability will always be the one that transcends it, because even in a perfect world with no bigotry and no bias, if there's steps in the polling place, how's Kenny getting in? Is he crawling up the stairs? Sorry to make you the example. There's a famous Supreme Court case about access where the man, I think, actually crawled up the stairs from his wheelchair onto the courthouse steps because the courthouse wasn't accessible. How is a blind person filling out the ballot? Are they just guessing? So there's always going to be the need for that disability accommodation. Even if we can eliminate all other discrimination, there will still always need to be disability education. We don't have to educate inspectors, in theory, on racial or gender or sexual orientation tolerance, but inspectors are honestly dumber about disability. They're much less informed. You know, they're not going to say, oh, you're a woman, you can't vote. You're black, you can't vote. But they might say, oh, you're cognitively impaired, you can't vote. That is a much more likely scenario, or somebody who appears like they don't understand. So
I've had people, when I've gone to vote personally, I've had people say like, where's your aid? I'm like, I don't need an aid, I can vote independently by myself, and they're like, oh, okay.
Yeah, see, there's an assumption because he's in a wheelchair, he can't make his own decisions. Even though his disability is physical, it's not cognitive, it's not emotional. They're mixing up his legs with his brain. People don't get it, and that's the thing. I've seen people who think blind people can't do something for themselves, where they say, oh, where's your helper? Because somehow being blind is tied to their intelligence. And I've seen my blind friends of mine say, I can't see, it doesn't affect my ability to understand. So, you were gonna ask a question in the back?
Hi, yeah, I was. Thank you so much for doing this.
Sure.
So, my question is more towards being prepared for voting sites, especially as someone who is now learning about this. What are some steps that we could potentially take? It's very tied to the question before. How can we be prepared to potentially potentially help someone if we do witness something like this?
Well-
You already previously mentioned, looking for very key contact numbers to just have on hand. Is there anything we could do or say to potentially help someone? who
Well, I
looks
have
like
some of
they
the
might be
contact
struggling
numbers
in
on
a
here,
polling location?
and some of them you honestly have to find yourself on election day, like the Board of Elections and where the duty judges are. Well, I mean, I think one thing that in particular for physical barriers, in this day and age, we all have phones on our camera. And that's one thing. If you see something and there's an argument that it's a physical obstruction or something that's not right, take a picture. They can't tell you no. As long as you're not taking a picture of the ballot, it's legal. You can take a picture of the poll site, you just can't legally take a picture of your ballot. My friend who had the issue today took a picture of the physical obstruction outside the poll site and he put it on Facebook before he called the Attorney General's office. So now he's got evidence of it.
So in addition to that, you're saying that jury duty or
Not jury
duty
duty.
judges are announced the day of elections.
Right, well, I mean, the Board of Elections has them a few days before.
A few days before. So what I'm hearing is someone who has access to a social media account that many other people could identify. Maybe it would additionally be a decent idea to announce who those people are.
Right, and that would be something you'd have to talk to the Board of Elections. But you know what, if you see something, social media is a great way to embarrass people if inspectors are not doing their job. You know, one thing I would say is, and I think it's something that should be on the agenda for the state legislature, when they train election inspectors, they shouldn't just train them on how to be inspectors, they should train them on disability tolerance. I don't think we do enough of that in this state, or in any state where we train the inspectors on knowing disability. I mean, I hate to say it, I've seen some really bad inspectors. And like I said, this one guy said, you have to show ID, and I said, no, I don't. I said, I'm a lawyer with the Democratic Party, you are not allowed to ask me for ID. He's like, well, I can if I want. And when he saw the policeman, his mind changed. But the fact that I had to call the town clerk and I knew her to do it is one thing. But how many people did he turn away earlier in the day who didn't show ID? They said he had been asking for ID earlier in the day. My only regret was that this happened at 7 p.m., not 7 a.m. At least I got him removed from it. He's not allowed to be an inspector ever again in Westchester. But the point is that you know, we have cameras on our phones. We have recording devices on our phones. If you have to record something, it's much easier to document things now than it was even 5 years ago. If you see something at the poll, it's like terrorism. If you see something, say something. If there's a problem, call the Board of Elections. Call Disability Rights New York. Call the Democratic Lawyers Council. But the first call should always be to the Board of Elections if something's going on. Because if there's a problem and the inspector is doing something they shouldn't do to restrict someone's right to vote, their job is to send someone out to address it. If you see somebody systematically sitting there saying not competent, challenging people based on competence, call the Board of Elections and call one of the legal groups, because that person shouldn't be there. It's the same as what they find that trick across the South, where the Republicans sit poll watchers to challenge every African-American voter or college students. These are tricks that if you see somebody doing this to every person who might have a disability or comes from a specific group home, I would call the Board of Elections and call one of the lawyer groups to say, no, you can't do that. You can't just sit there and say everybody from this group home is not competent to vote. Clearly there's a pattern if they're doing it the same way as the people who sit on the college campuses challenging people.
Let me just say one thing. I wouldn't wait to see it a second time. If you see any inspector challenge a person for competence, get involved then. You don't have time to stand around and see if he's gonna repeat it 5-10 minutes later. First time you see it, please report.
And it could be subtle. It could be, are you sure you know how to vote? They might not say competence, but if you hear an inspector say to a voter, that child voice, are you sure you know how to vote? Are you sure you know what you're doing? Talking to them, because that's another thing people do. They'll infantilize people with disabilities. I'm sure when they asked Kenny where his aide was, they said it in a childlike voice.
Yep, but I told them in a grown-up voice, please shut up, I know what I'm doing. I won't curse him out, but I'll just use very grown-up language, and luckily it hasn't happened, you know, it's only happened 2 times, and then I've fixed it. And then there was also not the last time, but the previous 2 times, my polling area, but the accessible entrance was locked when I went to go vote. So I had to call the Board of Elections to fix it, and now I already voted this time, but now for election day, just like previously, they fixed it. But this was like multiple times that I had to call and then email, and then now they've fixed it. But you just have to be persistent and don't give up.
And one thing certain people with certain disabilities is persistent. Autism in particular brings persistence. And people with disabilities, sorry, just get a second. A lot of people with disabilities will take that right to vote very seriously because it's been denied for so long. 100 years ago, people were put in institutions based on things like autism, cerebral palsy, other impairments. Those were big ones that they put people in institutions. And when they were institutionalized 100 years ago, they weren't voting.
It wasn't 100 years ago, it was in the late 70s that was still happening.
I'm just saying it was worse then. It started getting better in the early part of the 20th century. Not perfect, better. There were less people institutionalized. That's about the time they stopped sterilization of people with disabilities as well. So you can see how things have changed. And there's still today, look, I mean, how many of you have heard of Willowbrook in Staten Island? Willowbrook was in place for people with disabilities where they were tortured and abused, and these people didn't belong there, most of them. They were competent. They weren't voting. They were lucky if they got to go to the bathroom. So, this is a societal bias we have. Oh, you have a disability, you can't make a decision for yourself. Just because somebody has a disability and can't do one thing doesn't mean they can't do another. Just because you can't manage your money doesn't mean you don't know Trump's an asshole. Again, it's partisan, I can say that. I'm just saying. The point is, most people know, again, there are things we all can't do. When I was a kid, I wanted to play third baseman for the Mets. I can't do that. I realized I was out of shape and overweight when I got older. The point being, that has no bearing on my ability to vote or be an attorney. We all have things we can and can't do. And just because you need help with one thing, a guardianship from one thing, I've had people I've represented, they have safety issues on the internet, they don't know how to do certain things appropriately, but they can still make a determination about who they want to vote for. And honestly, a lot of young people, when they're 18, 19, if they are a little slower, do listen to their parents, and that has both positives and negatives. But their parent can't tell them, you have to vote Republican or you have to vote Democratic. If the person walks in and the father or mother is sitting there and saying, you have to vote for this person, and they say no, father or mother has to back off. Father or mother can only help them if they choose. Sorry. Yeah.
Oh, no worries. I was just going to say another thing that is very common when the general public is interacting with people with disabilities is to be overly helpful. Just because there's virtually nothing in our education system about disabilities, so people might follow them around and think and actually watch them cast their vote, and their intention is to help, but they're actually stamping on that person's rights. So that's something to look for if you want to.
What people is what we say infantilize people, and it's interesting. Sorry?
My blind friend, the lady
Right.
sat there and watched him.
And what's very interesting about it is if you don't look disabled, I've had people tell me, well, you're not really disabled, you don't look disabled. Now, if I walk out with Kenny, sorry to keep making you the example, but you're the best example, they will only think he's disabled, not me, because his disability is visible. So he has to deal with that a lot more than I do. Plus, when they hear I'm a lawyer, they don't do that. But the point is, people generally with that infantilizing and overhelping, it happens to blind people, to deaf people, and people in wheelchairs. It doesn't happen to people with hidden disabilities unless they're noticeably impaired. If somebody like myself or other people who have hidden disabilities that are not obvious, we're not going to get that because people are not going to think you're disabled. They're not going to think somebody with epilepsy or narcolepsy or a learning disability or something that's not visible is disabled. But somebody in a wheelchair, they're going to see it and say, well, like Kenny said, they're going to infantilize them and tell them, are you sure you can vote without your aid?
And I tell them, yes, we fucking can.
An aid that doesn't exist. Seamus?
Yeah. One thing I do also want to mention, since this is the 7-year anniversary of Hurricane Sandy, also one thing is sort of very important is to make sure you also keep up with any sort of news around voting, election day. As some of you may recall, on, election day 2012, Governor Cuomo actually signed an executive order saying that anyone could vote that was in the 5 boroughs, Nassau, Suffolk, Rockland, or Westchester, could vote by affidavit anywhere in the state. So one of the things you may want, no, just because we may, with acts of God, we don't know what may happen and what type of future executive orders there may be, but there is something that's like happening. Make sure you just keep in touch with local news, because if there's something saying that anyone can vote at their board of elections, for example, that's just one.
Or even worse, 9/11 happened on the primary day.
Exactly. So.
And so there was a former, how many of you might know Ben Yee was involved with the Manhattan Young Dems many years ago? Ben Yee was working in Ohio in, I think, whatever year Seamus is referring to. What year? And for Obama, so what did he do? He lives in Manhattan. He didn't vote absentee. Once Cuomo said you could vote anywhere in the state, he drove to Western New York and voted in Chautauqua County, the westernmost county in New York. Even though he lived in Manhattan, he voted in Chautauqua County and then drove back to Ohio. Now, what that does is it limited his ability, because the ballots there only allowed him to vote for statewide office. His vote for, he couldn't vote for Congress or state legislature or anything districted, but he could vote for governor or I mean, he only cared about voting for Obama, in all honesty. But you would only allowed to vote for things that you're eligible, so he only got to vote for statewide elected officials or the presidency, but that was a provision the governor made in that situation due to the emergency, and I don't remember, and you're probably, most of you were too young. Andrew, do you remember what they did, or Mike, on 9/11 with the primary?
They redid it.
Suspended.
I don't remember them doing that in Westchester. That might have been the city only.
They redid it in the city.
It might have only been in, and I don't know if it was Manhattan or the whole boroughs.
But
They
yes,
suspended for 2 weeks.
Because there were people from Westchester on Long Island who couldn't vote, but they didn't redo it up by us.
But the big thing is just make sure you also keep in touch with like any sort of local news, because they could you guys also, you don't want to be in a situation where you could be also that they're saying you can vote in this other place that's not accessible, like some sort of county office, which should be accessible, but.
But again, there is this whole thing, and this comes out of Westchester. I'm sure you all know who Andrea Stewart Cousins is. Her first election that she lost by 18 votes, there was a whole big thing about right church, wrong pew, where you go in and you vote in the right polling place, but you vote in the wrong election district. And there were people who were either in her Senate district or the district she was at the time running for, and were not eligible, or they were in her district and they voted in the other. Long story short, there was an argument about whether you could vote. Votes should count if you were in the right polling place, wrong election district. And the law is, you can vote in the races you're eligible to vote for. So if you're in Manhattan and you go to a different part of Manhattan, your vote is only going to count for districted rate. Your vote will count for anything statewide, countywide, but for districted races, if you're in the same district. So if you're in Carolyn Maloney's district and you go 20 blocks north, you're probably not going to get your assembly vote counted, but your congressional and state senate might still count. So it's only what you're eligible for on the ballot face. Like the example I said about Ben Yee in Chautauqua County, he could only vote for statewide officials there because clearly his congressional and state legislative, and I'm not sure judges in the city, are not the same. But now I live in Westchester, which is part of a 5-county judicial district. I could go up to Putnam County in that situation and vote and probably still get my assembly and senate and congressional counted because I'm in the same district, and my judicial votes. But if I go north to Dutchess County, my votes for judge will count, but not my votes for state legislature, and depending where Congress. But the point being, you are allowed to do that as long as you realize those things that are out of district you're not going to be able to vote for. Yes?
What services are in place to get people
Sorry?
to polling sites?
I didn't hear what you said?
What services are in place to get people?
Depending on where you live and depending on the need, there's Board of Elections. People haven't been known in Westchester, and I don't know how this works in the city, to call the Board of Elections for rides. They can't give rides, but campaigns give rides. Outside the city, there's paratransit for people who can't drive. So there are services. You would go through your county or the city's disability services office. The mayor's office of people with disabilities would probably be your best bet for finding ways to get people to access the poll sites in the city who are not disabled, who are not able to on their own. But obviously that's something that should be planned ahead of time as well, not something that's just decided on election day.
And just with that, actually, so one thing that's very important that we make sure we keep the legislature, namely state senate, next year, is because there is a constitutional amendment that needs to be ratified by the next session, that actually would create no excuse absentee voting. So, and then in which case it would come to a vote in 2021 statewide. So it would be the case where anyone who has a disability would be able to ask for an absentee ballot, vote by mail for any reason whatsoever. Right now you have to do it for very specific reasons, and that's actually in the state constitution.
But we're going to no fault absentee.
Yeah.
What were you saying, Mike?
That's what he said.
Yeah.
And also with early voting, it reduces the need for absentee voting. Any other questions? I'll be around for a little while while Jordan does his thing. And if anybody wants a card, I have cards. If you have any questions about law.
So while I get set up, I'm just gonna call up one of our co-sponsors. This is Mike, who's head of the 504 Democratic Club. Thank you, Schweinsberg, who's head of the 504 Democratic Club, who really does a great job lifting up voices of the disabled community in the political world.
I know. That's why this old man's here. I am happy to go around and talk to clubs about 504 and our issues. I don't know where a poll is not going to get my way, so I'm sorry about that. I always like to start with a little exercise. Would everyone here who either identifies as being a person with a disability or who has a family member or close friend that they'd like to advocate for, please raise your hand. Right. So that's the case everywhere I go. 50 to 70% of the people either identify or have a family member. They don't know what to do politically to help them. Well, 36 years ago or so, 504 was founded, and it is now it was the nation's first, and is now the nation's first and largest advocating for the civil rights of people with disabilities. What I do with the permission of the club I'm addressing is invite members to co-join, because we are a citywide club. We are an issues-oriented club, and I can't stay because I have another thing, but I'm going to leave a little stack of my cards, and if anybody has interest in joining or knows someone who would, that's it. Andrew is a member of the club, and guess what he got? He's holding up the membership form. Real cheap. We meet up for once a month. Next month we're hosting a couple of assembly members, I think 3 assembly members, but all of whom are coming to address us on disability issues. So if you want to know more, if you want to know how to advocate politically for the civil rights of people with disabilities.
Is it at the same place?
Renwood Gardens?
Yes.
Yes.
And I just want to add, talking about electives with disability, because she's out about it. Yuli Neo is actually out that she's on the autism spectrum.
That's right. We are very definitely underrepresented in terms of elected officials. Giovanni Williams. But there are a fair number of people, but we are still we're drastically underrepresented by people with disabilities. So, we want to support people with disabilities who might want to run for office, and of course, support people who support people with disabilities. So please come and join us. Andrew's got the membership forms, and I'll leave the cards just if you have questions. Right? Thank you, Tom.
All right, perfect. So